In 1894, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote an essay for McClure's magazine as part of a series called My First Book, where authors like Arthur Conan Doyle and Rudyard Kipling would describe how they went about writing their first contribution to literature. In describing how he finally sat down to write Treasure Island, Stevenson said, "It was to be a story for boys, no need of psychology or fine writing, and I had a boy at hand to be a touchstone. Women were excluded." Are we sure about that? Treasure Island, serialized in late 1881 to 1882 and published as a complete novel in 1883, was immediately praised for standing out among contemporary adventure stories. It's stylish and romantic, yet also eerie, violent, and grounded. It engages familiar tropes while slyly subverting them, and its narrative voice somehow captures both the wickedness of piracy and the innocence of its young narrator. W.E. Henley called it touched with genius. The novel pushed back against the imperial moralizing prevalent at the time and set itself apart from the usual Robinsonade, the genre of adventure fiction inspired by Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. If you're my age, you're probably most familiar with Disney's 2002 adaptation of Treasure Island, Treasure Planet, where the protagonist Jim is an edgy, solar surfing bad boy who has to get whipped into shape to learn to care for others and stand up against his adoptive cyborg father figure. Well, Stevenson's Jim Hawkins is a pretty far cry from Joseph Gordon-Levitt. For visuals, I'll be using clips from the 1990 adaptation of Treasure Island, as it's a really solid adaptation, even if it's a little boring, and also I love Christian Bale. In Stevenson's novel, Jim is an apron-wearing, eager-to-please kid living in the mid to late 18th century who just wants to help his parents run their inn, the Admiral Benbow. His life changes when a delirious, dipsomaniac pirate who goes by Billy Bones barges in and terrorizes his family and their guests. Jim's father becomes ill and dies within the opening chapters, and before that grief is even settled, Billy Bones drops dead too. Jim's mother discovers the infamous treasure map, and once Schuyler Trelawney and Dr. Livesey hear about it, Jim is whisked into an adventure he never once asked for. Squire Trelawney brings together the rest of the iconic cast for their sail on the Hispaniola to the titular Treasure Island. This includes Captain Smollett, Mr. Arrow, the real-life historical figure of Israel Hands, and, of course, Long John Silver. As the cabin boy, Jim bonds with Silver, the sea cook, over the course of the trip and is personally offended when he overhears Silver talking to another young man about a mutiny in the iconic apple barrel scene. From there, Jim warns the captain, squire, and doctor about the mutiny, but they're already docked, and once the pirates take the island, Jim just keeps getting separated from everyone.
Young Jim can tell us... Hold on, where's Jim Hawkins?
Young and impulsive, Jim runs around trying his best to help. He stumbles upon the maroon Ben Gunn and temporarily reunites with the others more by luck than by strategy. And most notably, he goes off on his own to try and take the Hispaniola, where he gets in a fight with Izzy Hands and, almost by accident, kills him. With 2 guns. Throughout all of this, Jim shows very little true agency. He reacts to the adults around him, follows their commands, and processes his emotions intensely and privately. His moral sense is unwavering, but his control over events is minimal. To a Victorian reader, he doesn't quite match the genre expectations of the self-reliant, bold boy hero so iconic in adventure fiction. To the Victorians, the ideal man was one who dedicated his life to his work and to public service, who mastered his own self-control and public rectitude, and any boy worth his salt should be able to prove that he was well on his way to becoming that strong Victorian man. The boy adventure stories that Stevenson aimed to contribute to typically upheld these beliefs, giving their young protagonist a play ethic to precede their future manly work ethic, and giving them tools to one day become that man. But when you really look at who Jim is, how he's treated, and how he works, you can see that he is not a strapping young boy on his way to becoming a man, but trapped somewhere else entirely, holding a variety of much more feminine traits, both personally and narratively. So, when Stevenson set out to write a story for boys that excluded women, did he succeed in doing so? R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island is a classic example of a Robinsonade. 3 young British boys shipwreck on an island and must survive while navigating cannibalistic native people and villainous pirates. Like Jim, the boy protagonist of Coral Island, Ralph, narrates his own story, looking back on and describing his adventure to the reader. But unlike Jim, Ralph loves the shenanigans he gets into during his time at sea and while shipwrecked. Just flipping through the book, you get quotes like, "Oh, how my heart bounded with delight," and "my heart expanded more and more with an exulting gladness, the like of which I had never felt before." Mara Gubar directly compares these quotes to those from Jim in Treasure Island, quoting, "I was very uneasy and alarmed. I was in mortal fear. I was so utterly terrified. I jumped in my skin for terror." And those are all in the first few chapters. She also points out Jim's haunting relationship to Long John Silver's parrot, who, when Jim was sneaking around sleeping pirates, alerted them to his presence by shouting,
"Piece of the bait! Piece of the bait!" But I thought sailors had talking parrots as pets.
Talking parrots?
Let me read the final few sentences of the entire book. He says, "Oxen and wain ropes would not bring me back to that accursed island, and the worst dreams that ever I have are when I hear the surf booming about its coasts, or start upright in bed, with the sharp voice of Captain Flint still ringing in my ears."
"Piece of the bait! Piece of the bait!"
And let's look back at Ralph. When he says energetically, "I have spent many of the happiest months in my life on that Coral Island." And without waiting to be further questioned, I launched out into a glowing account of the happy life that Jack and Peterkin and I had spent together, and related minutely every circumstance that befell us while on the island. While Stevenson admitted to being heavily inspired by the Coral Island, he definitely took his boy protagonist in another direction. Jim is not excited by danger, adventure, or even the possibility of treasure. He does not at all engage in that Victorian play ethic, and even when they all reach the promised treasure, Jim is more fascinated by organizing the types of gold than by the wealth itself. Of course, Jim is not the only Victorian boy protagonist who has a bad time and then learns from it. Look at Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. Like Jim, Oliver doesn't have any parental figures around to help him throughout his narrative, and he finds himself under the wing of villains serving as surrogate parents. Noteflamacher, in fact, describes Silver as a combination of Fagin's willingness and the brutality of Sykes, the two villains who take in Oliver. Unlike Jim, though, Oliver ends his story by being adopted by Mr. Brownlow, with his true parentage being revealed and his inheritance being secured. Noteflamacher also points out that while Stevenson ends his story with Silver getting away and Jim just kind of moving on, Dickens must annihilate his male infractors in order for Oliver to stay pure, unsoiled, and able to safely re-enter the genteel and feminine world from which he was barred. So even when we have a young boy character face similar struggles to Jim, Jim's inability to escape his trauma
"Piece of the bait! Piece of the bait!"
and grow past it to re-enter society as a man still sets him apart from the expectations of the boy protagonist. Alexandra Vallon opens the second half of her essay with, Jim, though he may be an adult by the time he narrates, declines to identify himself as an adult narrator. Rather, he positions himself as an eternal boy. While Ralph in the Coral Island specifies himself to be retired from seafaring by the time he writes the account of his adventure, Jim just opens his narrative by saying, Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen asked me to write down the whole particulars of Treasure Island. Because of this, there is a spectrum of reactions from scholars, either describing Treasure Island as an adult recalling his youthful adventures, or a story told by the child hero. There are a few times when narrator Jim is able to interject a learned knowledge, like in chapter 24 when he explains that he now knows the huge slimy monsters he came across are, in fact, sea lions and are not dangerous. But that doesn't prove that narrator Jim is a man, he just now knows what sea lions are. Vallon points out Jim's lack of a conclusion for himself in the final chapter of Treasure Island. We don't get to see him grow up. While Jim is explaining what came of Silver, Ben Gunn, and the other surviving men, he doesn't say what he did with his part of the treasure. All we know is that, as of writing, he's still operating under the surveillance of Trelawney and Livesey. Jim does describe what Vaillant calls the Bildungsroman of another character, Abraham Gray, as Gray saved his money, studied a profession, got married, and became mate and part-time owner of a fine full-rigged ship. So, in Treasure Island, there is the capacity to become a man, just not for Jim. There are a lot of adaptations of Treasure Island. I was most surprised to find out about Orson Welles' 1972 adaptation, which was a passion project of his and also critically considered to be the worst film ever. I did not watch it. But before Welles, we had Disney's first step into live-action films with their 1950 adaptation, featuring like a 7-year-old playing Jim. But before that, we had many black and white and even silent films. Most notably, I want to talk about the 1920s silent film starring Shirley Mason as Jim Hawkins. Yeah, a girl. It's like Marnie from Girls and Peter Pan Live. According to Notflamacher, this decision was made because previous adaptations of Treasure Island included female actresses, like a woman playing Long John Silver, and the added character of Squire Trelawney's daughter, which apparently upstaged the young male Jim actor. It's noted that most attempts at adapting Treasure Island in this age aim to make the narratives equally suitable for women as for men, but many believed this effort to be futile. While Jim's age is never mentioned in the novel, most scholars agree that he is around 14 years old, which is the age Christian Bale was when he was filming the role. But most adaptations depict Jim as much younger. Jim's sensitivity and lack of agency clearly read to directors as youthful and feminine as they create their adaptations of Treasure Island. Specifically, in Muppets Treasure Island, Blind Pew straight up mistakes Jim for a girl and doesn't even hear him out when Jim says that he's not.
Yes, take me to Billy Bones, my pet.
You've come to the wrong place. There's no Billy Bones here, and I'm not a girl.
Oh, I may be visually challenged, but I can see you're lying.
But keep in mind, this is the mid-90s when every man would be called a girl if he wasn't masculine enough, but still. I guess the question is then, what happens when we brute force some masculinity into Jim Hawkins? Treasure Planet's Jim is the man of the Admiral Benbow. He doesn't help out his mom as much as he could, and he's unable to express any emotional vulnerability to her. Like Book Jim, Disney Jim is suspicious of Long John Silver at first, but after spending time with him, begins to trust him and see him as a father figure. But Disney Jim doesn't really have any other choice when it comes to parental figures, as the film combined Squire Trelawney and Dr. Livesey into one bumbling idiot of a character that's honestly too busy having his weird love story with gender-bent Captain Smollett to be any help to Jim's development, while Book Jim has a variety of men to look up to and doesn't make as intense of a connection to just one of them, shown specifically by his apathy towards Silver at the end of the novel. Book Jim doesn't seem to need an outlet for his emotions. He describes himself crying at his father's death, at Billy Bones' death, when he has to leave his mother to go on his adventure, and I think most notably, when Dr. Livesey chastises him about sneaking off to the Hispaniola shortly after his brush with death. Disney Jim needs his black jacket, edgy hair, and his solar surfing time to get his emotions going. His connection to Silver is intense, but it is distinctly masculine. Silver teaches Jim to do hard work like swabbing the deck and interacting with the other harsh men on the ship. Jim even drops his head against Silver's stomach to hide from his tears, and it's not until the end of the movie that the two of them can actually hug and wipe away their manly tears. Treasure Planet already undermines a lot of aspects of Treasure Island that made it so genre-defying, like its anti-imperialist sentiment and the unflattering light that the island itself is painted in, and its lack of drawn-out fight scenes. But it also just makes Jim, way cooler and autonomous, and more of a standard character one would expect from an adventure boy. While Stevenson definitely succeeded in writing a story with primarily male characters, the attention to fear, emotion, and the suppression of Jim's Bildungsroman all point to a level of womanness that Stevenson may not have intended to include, but definitely did. Looking at contemporary essays on Stevenson, and I'm primarily using here Henry James's essay simply titled Robert Louis Stevenson, Stevenson was an incredibly self-conscious writer and didn't believe any of his work, especially not his first novel, to hold any kind of real literary weight. It seems to me that Stevenson just didn't believe that he was able to write women, and his explicit exclusion of them wasn't out of misogynistic hate, but out of insecurity that he wouldn't be able to write them well. But I think that the nuances to Jim's character and the feminine touches Stevenson was able to grant him proves that he probably very much could have included women or even young girls in his book, and I trust that he would have been able to do a good job. Henry James even has to state in his essay that the protagonists of Stevenson's novels are not puppets with vague faces, like Stevenson believed. Henry James predicted Treasure Island to become a classic, and it very much did, despite Stevenson's belief. It is in the same vein that I claim that, despite Stevenson's goal, he did not write a boys' novel that excluded women. Rather, he wrote a character, Jim Hawkins, who is suspended beyond manhood and expresses many gender ideals usually reserved for girls and women, both then and even today. He has compassion and empathy for characters like Ben Gunn, the Marooned Pirates, and even Long John Silver and Blind Pew. He is vulnerable and passive, described by some scholars as a pawn in the hands of the men in his life. He rejects greed and power, and in a way rejects any kind of growth into manhood, choosing to stay in his more passive status. He does not possess what Victorians or even modern readers would look for in a strong adventure boy protagonist. He's outside of that expectation, in the same way many women are. So thank you, Robert Louis Stevenson. I like to think that if he had lived long enough to contribute even more to our literary canon, he would have eventually explored his ability to write compelling female characters, as briefly seen in his short story The Waif Woman, which was published almost 20 years after his death. But in this reality, we have Jim and his passive feminine ways. Maybe one day we'll get an adaptation with a gender-bent Jim Hawkins just to tie this all together, but until then, I have to go read all of Robert Louis Stevenson's other work.